The Assembly will come back to order. We're going to go to Order of Business 8, motions, resolutions, and notices.
Notice of exemption, April 25, 2023. The Fiscal Analysis Division, pursuant to Joint Standing Law 14.6, has determined the eligibility for exemption of Senate Bill 234. Wayne Thorley, Fiscal Analysis Division.
Order of Business 12, general file and third reading.
Assembly Bill 265, introduced by Assemblyman Gorlow et al., Senator Wynn, enacting mental health, adding certain members to the subcommittee on the mental health of children of the Commission on Behavioral Health, creating a statewide mental health consortium, prescribing the membership powers and duties of the statewide mental health consortium, authorizing the statewide mental health consortium to request the drafting of not more than one legislative measure for each regular session of the legislature, and providing other matters properly in thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 16, end of Section 16, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 265 creates a statewide children's mental health consortium.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 269, introduced by Assemblyman Brittany Miller et al., enacting to education, revising provisions governing performance evaluations of certain post-probationary teachers, and providing other matters properly thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 2, end of Section 2, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. AB 269 makes certain changes to evaluation cycles for post-probationary teachers. The bill repeals requirements to include pupil growth and learning goals in teacher evaluations, and the bill also provides that certain provisions concerning evaluation of post-probationary teachers apply retroactively to such evaluations conducted on or after July 1st of 2021.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 38 ayes, 4 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed or transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 282, introduced by Assemblyman Summers Armstrong et al., enacting to substitute teachers, requiring school districts to provide certain substitute teachers with a subsidy for the purchase of health insurance coverage, and providing other matters properly thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 3, end of Section 3, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 282 requires school districts to provide a monthly subsidy to full-time substitute teachers for the purchase of health insurance. In order to receive the subsidies, such teachers must provide proof of health insurance coverage. The bill prohibits a school district or public school from taking certain actions that would prevent a substitute teacher from qualifying for the subsidy.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 31 ayes, 11 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed or transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 286, introduced by Assemblyman Brittany Miller et al., relating to elections, requiring a person who administers a county or city jail to establish a policy that ensures a person who is detained in the jail may register to vote and vote in an election, requiring the Secretary of State to allow certain persons detained in a county jail or city jail to use a certain system of approved electronic transmission to register to vote and to cast a ballot in an election, requiring a person who administers a county or city jail to submit a report to the Secretary of State after each election, prohibiting electioneering near certain areas of a jail, providing penalty, and providing other matters properly in thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 18, end of Section 18, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 286 requires the administrator of a county or city jail to establish a policy ensuring qualified persons who are detained in the jail may register to vote and or vote in an election. Also, the administrator must establish a process for the collection and security of mail ballots or the use of the e-system through the Secretary of State to register or cast a ballot.
Are there any further remarks? Assemblyman Hibbets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of AB 286. Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
Thank you. I am voting yes on 286 for one simple reason. I took an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution, and for those who have not yet been convicted of any crime, voting is a constitutional right. To stand in the way of simple provisions that would help them exercise their constitutional right, I believe, would be an act against the oath I took. Our Constitution declares a citizen is innocent until proven guilty. Our Constitution declares that the innocent have the right to vote. I took an oath to protect that right. I'm voting yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 39 ayes, 3 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed and ordered transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 309, introduced by Assemblywoman Hanson, an act relating to property rights, authorizing the use of electronic ballots for the election and removal of members of the Executive Board of a Unit Owners Association of a Common Interest Community, and for the election of delegates or representatives to exercise the voting rights of units, owners, and an association, authorizing a member of the Executive Board who is subject to removal to submit a written request for a meeting of the Executive Board to discuss the member's removal, revising requirements concerning the provision of certain notices by an association, specifying that an association is authorized to conduct a vote for the election or removal of a member of the Executive Board without a meeting, authorizing an association that conducts a vote without a meeting to allow the unit owners to vote by using a voting machine, establishing requirements relating to the use of electronic voting for the election or removal of a member of the Executive Board without a meeting, authorizing money in the operating account of an association to be withdrawn without the usual required signatures for the purpose of making certain automatic and annual payments, requiring the Commission for Common Interest Communities and Condominium Hotels to adopt regulations establishing the requirements relating to the transfer of certain items upon the termination or assignment of a management agreement and providing other matters properly thereto. The people stated that are represented in Senate and Assembly do enact as follows. Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 12, end of Section 12, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 309 authorizes the use of secret electronic ballots for the election or removal of members of the Executive Board or a Unit Owners Association of a Common Interest Community, and for the election of delegates or representatives to exercise the voting rights of unit owners in such an association. The bill also provides that money in the operating account of an association may be withdrawn without the usual required signatures for the purpose of making automatic payments for certain reoccurring costs. Mr. Speaker, Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
I know you've all been waiting for it. Here's your HOA bill for this session, so I look forward to your support. Thank you.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed and ordered transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 339, introduced by Assemblywoman Brittany Miller et al., an act relating to education requiring the inclusion of certain information regarding pupil achievement to be included in the annual reports of accountability submitted by the Boards of Trustees of school districts, the sponsors of charter schools, and the State Board of Education, and providing other matters properly thereto. The people stated that are represented in Senate and Assembly to enact as follows. Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 4, end of Section 4, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 339 requires certain annual accountability reports on pupil achievement to include information on pupils who have accrued 10 or more absences within the school year, and pupils who received at least 4 consecutive weeks of instruction in a core academic subject from someone other than a licensed teacher, unless certain it's that word. No, actually, it's another word. Apply. We'll skip it. Thank you. This information must be reported separately by gender and from groups identified in the statewide system of accountability for public schools. This bill is effective on July 1st, 2023.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 39 ayes, 3 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed in order transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 354, introduced by Assemblywoman Howdigy, an act relating to firearms prohibiting, under certain circumstances, the possession of a firearm in or within a certain distance of an election site, revising the definition of the term firearms importer or manufacturer, defining certain terms prohibiting a person from engaging in certain acts relating to unfinished frames or receivers, ready frames or receivers, and market frames or receivers, revising provisions relating to certain acts involving unfinished frames or receivers, ready frames or receivers, and market frames or receivers which are not imprinted with a serial number under certain circumstances, providing penalties, repealing certain provisions relating to firearms, and providing other matters properly relating thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 9, end of Section 9, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Howdigy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 354 prohibits, under certain circumstances, a person from possessing or causing a firearm to be present within 100 feet of an entrance to a place the person knows or reasonably should know is an election site. This prohibition does not apply to law enforcement officers engaged in the performance of official duties, a private guard, or security personnel hired by the owner of the facility or property in which the election site is located. Additionally, this bill prohibits a person from 1, selling, offering to sell, or transferring, and 2, possessing, purchasing, transporting, or receiving an unfinished frame or receiver, ready frame or receiver, or market frame or receiver, unless the recipient is a firearm dealer, importer, or manufacturer, or such a firearm has been imprinted with a serial number. Order of Business 15, Mr. Speaker.
Order of Business 15.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Assembly took action to make Nevada's families and communities safer by passing Assembly Bill 355, which would raise the age requirement to purchase an assault weapon from 18 to 21. Now, with Assembly Bill 354, we have another chance to take a step in the right direction and protect everyday Nevadans from the epidemic of gun violence. Since 2020, many poll workers and everyday Nevadans have felt in danger at their voting location. The right of a registered voter to safely and freely access the ballot is fundamental to our democracy. Prohibiting guns at polling locations is important for ensuring voter safety, preventing voter intimidation, promoting peaceful elections, upholding the law, and reflecting public opinion. This legislation will also fix a loophole with a disturbing new trend in crime. Ghost guns have become increasingly common in violent crimes that ravage our communities and tear apart Nevada families. In 2021, the number of ghost guns recovered from crime scenes doubled from the previous year, and law enforcement agencies across the nation are raising the alarm, including at the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Assembly Bill 354 will prohibit guns in polling places, protecting Nevadans' right to vote, and crack down on the loopholes in current law that could otherwise make these untraceable ghost guns even more prevalent in violent crime. Keeping our communities safe should not be a partisan issue, so I urge all of my colleagues to support Assembly Bill 354. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Are there any further remarks? Assemblyman Urick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today in opposition of AB 354. Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
This bill is a classic example of a solution that is in search of a problem. A review of the statistics reveals that actual incidents of armed individuals showing up at voting sites are rare. So what purpose does this legislation really serve? Furthermore, the very issues that this bill attempts to mitigate may, in fact, create a variety of other troublesome consequences. Consider these conceivable scenarios. A young mom is carrying a legally concealed handgun in her purse when she runs into the grocery store. And she's on the phone and misses a sign indicating that this is an early voting place that day. Should she be arrested? Or perhaps a young man goes to the mall with some friends and has his legally concealed handgun and doesn't see the sign that indicates that early voting is taking place that day on the premises. Should he be arrested? Or what if a retired police officer who carries a legally concealed handgun goes into City Hall during the week that a special election is taking place? Should she be arrested? NRS requires Clark County to have at least 25 early voting locations that operate anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks before an election, and at least 100 polling places on Election Day. That does not include locations where there may be a ballot box or a drop box. This past November, there were 125 sites located across Clark County alone on Election Day, where I, as a retired law enforcement officer with a legal permit to carry my handgun, could be arrested by inadvertently being in one of these many places on Election Day. If there are, as the proponents of this bill suggest, increased incidents where an armed individual shows up at a polling location to intimidate, threaten, or otherwise harass voters or poll workers, there already exist laws on our books that can address those situations. For example, under federal law, 18 U.S.C. 594 makes it illegal to intimidate, threaten, coerce, or to attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person for the purpose of interfering with their right to vote. 18 U.S. 241 makes it illegal for 2 or more persons to agree to injure, threaten, or intimidate a person in the exercise of any right secured by the Constitution, including the right to vote. But we don't need to rely on federal law to protect our elections because Nevada law also prohibits such conduct. NRS 293-710 makes it a felony to threaten to use any force, intimidation, coercion, violence, restraint, or undue influence in connection with any election. NRS 293-730 makes it a felony to remain in or outside of any polling place so as to interfere with the conduct of an election.
Assemblyman Urick, you are at your 3 minutes. If you could please wrap up.
Yes, sir. The reality is 354 creates unnecessary complexities which serve no real purpose because the risks are nominal, and we already have laws on the books to address these issues without removing firearms from the hands of law-abiding citizens. Accordingly, I respectfully ask that you vote no on AB 354. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Are there further remarks on Assembly Bill 354? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed and order transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 371, introduced by Assemblywoman Cohen et al., Senator Orenshaw, an act relating to parentage, adopting provisions of the Uniform Parentage Act, revising provisions relating to the establishment of a parent-child relationship and the presumption of parentage, establishing provisions concerning the voluntary acknowledgement of parentage and denial of parentage by certain persons, authorizing the State Board of Health to adopt regulations relating to an acknowledgement of parentage or denial of parentage, establishing provisions governing genetic testing and proceedings to adjudicate parentage, establishing and revising various provisions relating to proceedings to adjudicate parentage, authorizing a person who claims to be a de facto parent of a child to be adjudicated as a parent of the child in certain circumstances, authorizing a court to adjudicate a child to have more than 2 parents in certain circumstances, establishing and revising provisions relating to assisted reproduction and gestational agreements, providing for the right of a gestational carrier to make all health care decisions regarding the gestational carrier and the pregnancy of the gestational carrier, repealing various provisions relating to parentage, providing penalty, and providing other matters properly relating thereto. The people stated that are represented in the Senate and Assembly to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 136, end of Section 136, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 371 enacts the provisions of the Uniform Parentage Act, which is a set of uniform laws governing parentage and the establishment of parent and child relationship. Among other things, the bill revises various provisions relating to proceedings and adjudication of parentage, provisions relating to assisted reproduction and gestational agreements.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 378, introduced by the Committee on Government Affairs and Act relating to public employees, revising certain provisions relating to the negotiation, mediation, and arbitration of collective bargaining agreements with the Executive Department of State Government and providing other matters properly laid thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 4, end of Section 4, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Duran.
Thank you, Speaker. Assembly Bill 378 revives certain provisions related to the timing of negotiations, mediation, and arbitration of the collective bargaining agreements with the state government. This bill is effective July 1, 2023.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 401, introduced by Assemblywoman Howdegay, an act relating to nursing, revising provisions governing the ratio of faculty members to students in courses that provide clinical training at schools of practical nursing and at schools of professional nursing, and providing other matters properly laid thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 4, end of Section 4, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Howdegay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 401 authorizes an approved school of practical or professional nursing to determine the appropriate ratio of faculty members to students for a course that provides clinical training. The ratio must not exceed 1 faculty member for every 12 students.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declared passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 405, introduced by the Committee on Judiciary, an act relating to criminal procedure, authorizing a justice court or municipal court to establish a program for the treatment of mental illness or intellectual disabilities, and providing other matters properly laid thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 7, end of Section 7, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 405 authorizes a justice court or municipal court to establish a program for the treatment of mental illness or intellectual disabilities and to transfer original jurisdiction of a case involving an eligible defendant to the district court if the justice court or municipal court has not established such a program. The bill further provides that the district court, justice court, or municipal court may impose sanctions against the defendant for the violation but allow the defendant to remain in the program.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 408, introduced by Assemblywoman Brown May, an act relating to motor vehicles, authorizing the removal of a vehicle or part of a vehicle from the highway following the issuance of a citation for reckless driving, prohibiting a tow car operator from charging fees or costs for the storage of such a vehicle until the vehicle has been stored for a certain period, requiring the owner of such a vehicle to pay a hardship tariff instead of the normal rate for the storage and removal of the vehicle under certain circumstances, revising provisions relating to the applicability of certain traffic laws concerning reckless driving, providing penalty, and providing other matters properly laid thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 3.7, end of Section 3.7, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Brown-May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 408 prohibits a person from driving a vehicle in an unauthorized trick driving display or facilitating an unauthorized trick driving display on the premise to which the public has access. Additionally, the bill authorizes a law enforcement officer to remove or cause the removed vehicle to be placed in safekeeping if the person driving or in actual physical control of the vehicle is issued a citation for reckless driving. Order Business 15.
Order Business 15.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill is really about road safety and preserving lives on our streets. We've worked really hard on this, and I really urge your support. Thank you.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed and ordered transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 414, introduced by Assemblywoman Backus, an act relating to powers of attorney, defining certain words and terms relating to powers of attorney for healthcare, establishing a form to create an advanced healthcare directive, revising provisions concerning witnesses to a principal signature of a power of attorney for healthcare, removing the requirement that in certain circumstances a certification of competency must be attached to a power of attorney, repealing provisions relating to the current form for powers of attorney for healthcare, and providing other matters properly thereto. People of the state of Nevada represented in Senate and Assembly to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 79, end of Section 79, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 414 replaces the form to create an advanced healthcare directive and revises provisions concerning witnessing the principal signature.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There were 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed and ordered transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 439, introduced by the Committee on Commerce and Labor, an act relating to insurance, providing that no provision for arbitration in a contract for health insurance is binding upon the named insured or any other person who makes a claim under the contract, repealing certain provisions related to provisions for arbitration in a contract for health insurance, and providing other matters properly thereto. The people of the state of Nevada represented in Senate and Assembly to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 22, end of Section 22, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. AB 439 repeals certain provisions related to arbitration in certain health insurance contracts, and in certain health insurance policies requires that language stating the provision is not binding upon the insured or any dependent of the insured.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed and ordered transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 442, introduced by the Committee on Commerce and Labor, an act relating to medical professions, requiring the Board of Medical Examiners to take certain actions in response to a complaint alleging that a physician, perfusionist, physician assistant, or practitioner of respiratory care has committed any act constituting domestic violence or sexual assault, requiring a law enforcement agency to notify the Board of a report alleging that a physician, perfusionist, physician assistant, or practitioner of respiratory care has committed any act constituting domestic violence or sexual assault, requiring the Board to adopt regulations setting forth circumstances under which the Board is required to summarily suspend, pending a formal hearing, the license of a physician, perfusionist, physician assistant, or practitioner of respiratory care in response to a complaint or a series of complaints, and providing other matters properly thereto. The people of the state of Nevada represented in Senate and Assembly to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 4, end of Section 4, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Assembly Bill 442 requires the Board of Medical Examiners to take certain actions in response to a complaint alleging that a physician, physician's assistant, or practitioner of respiratory care has committed an act which, if proven, would constitute domestic violence or sexual assault.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared it passed in order transmitted to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 444, introduced by Assemblywoman Backus, an act relating to child welfare, establishing various provisions governing proceedings relating to the custody, adoption, or protection of Indian children, or the termination of parental rights, revising certain provisions concerning the state register for adoptions, requiring the Division of Child and Family Services of the Department of Health and Human Services to adopt various regulations, requiring an agency which provides child welfare services to provide certain training for its personnel, requiring the division and the court administrator to submit certain reports to the chairs of the Senate and Assembly Standing Committees on Judiciary, authorizing the Supreme Court and the court administrator to adopt certain rules, repealing certain unnecessary provisions, and providing other measures properly laid thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 79, end of Section 79, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 444 establishes various provisions governing proceedings relating to the custody, adoption, or protection of Indian children, or the termination of parental rights to provide additional protections for Indian children in this state law.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 42 ayes, 0 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declare it passed in order to transmit to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 182, introduced by Assemblywoman Brittany Miller et al., an act relating to education, requiring a person to hold a baccalaureate degree before obtaining certain licenses for educational personnel or enrolling in an alternative route to licensure, requiring a person who holds an endorsement in certain fields of specialization to teach only in such a field, adding a license to serve as a substitute teacher as a kind of teaching license, and providing other matters properly in thereto. The people state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 7, end of Section 7, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman LaRue Hatch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 182 simply codifies current practice, which requires a bachelor's degree to get a standard teaching diploma. Thank you.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There are 22 ayes, 20 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 364, introduced by Assemblyman Cohen et al., an act relating to physician assistants, prescribing the settings in which a physician assistant is authorized to practice, revising the membership of the Board of Medical Examiners, authorizing physician assistants to perform medical services without the supervision of a physician, authorizing a physician assistant to perform certain medical services under certain circumstances, eliminating provisions governing the testing or examination of applicants for licensure as a physician assistant, prescribing certain authority and duties of a physician assistant and an advanced practice registered nurse, authorizing certain unlicensed persons to use the title inactive physician assistant, removing the requirement that a rural clinic be supervised by a physician, and providing other matters properly in thereto. The people's state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, to enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 205, end of Section 205, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 364 makes various changes to provisions governing physician assistants, including but not limiting to granting physician assistants similar authority and duties as other providers of health care who provide medical services independently and are otherwise treated in the same manner as such. Providers of health care requires a physician assistant who has practiced for less than 6,000 hours to enter into a collaborative agreement with a physician, and requires appointment of one member who is a physician assistant to the Board of Medical Examiners.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the chief clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The chief clerk will record the vote. There were 32 ayes, 10 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority declared passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 188, introduced by Assemblyman Kasama et al., Senators Orenshall and Donderloop, an act related to health care, revising the circumstances under which a physician is authorized to prescribe or recommend, and a manufacturer is authorized to provide or make available an investigational drug, biological product, or device, authorizing a manufacturer to provide or make available an individualized investigational treatment to a patient under certain circumstances, prohibiting an officer, employee, or agent of the state from preventing or attempting to prevent a patient from accessing such an individualized investigational treatment, authorizing a physician to prescribe or recommend an individualized investigational treatment under certain circumstances, providing a penalty and providing other matters appropriately thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows: Section 1, end of Section 1, Section 8, end of Section 8, end of the bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 of the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 188 allows a physician to prescribe or recommend and a manufacturer to provide or make available an investigational drug, biological product, or device to a patient diagnosed with a life-threatening or severely debilitating disease or condition. This bill further authorizes a physician, upon completion of certain biochemical analysis, to prescribe or recommend an individualized investigational treatment to such a patient. A manufacturer that meets certain requirements may provide such an individualized treatment. If a patient dies while receiving these treatments, the heir or heirs of the deceased patient are not personally liable for any related outstanding debts. Finally, AB 188 exempts certain manufacturers and healthcare providers from criminal penalties or professional discipline for specified actions related to investigational or individualized investigational treatments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any further remarks? Assemblyman Orentlicker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to Assembly Bill 188. Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
Our colleague from Assembly District 2 and I share a similar goal. We both want seriously ill Nevadans to have access to experimental medical treatments that might restore patient health. In fact, Nevadans already can get potentially life-saving treatments through the expanded access program of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. When doctors request FDA approval to prescribe experimental treatments for their seriously ill patients, the FDA approves more than 99% of the requests, generally within a matter of hours or days. In other words, the right to try already exists in Nevada, including for individualized experimental treatments. So what would this bill accomplish? It actually would jeopardize the health of Nevadans who suffer from serious illnesses. Under this bill, doctors could provide experimental treatments without FDA approval. Unfortunately, that's bad for patients, as we have seen when doctors provide experimental stem cell treatments without FDA approval. What we have seen for many patients is that unapproved stem cell treatments have not helped. Rather, the treatments have led to life-threatening infections, chronic pain, and even death. If we want to safeguard patient health, we need to ensure that Nevadans always receive the protection that FDA oversight provides. I urge you to vote no on this bill.
Are there any further remarks? Assemblywoman LaRue Hatch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
I also rise in opposition to AB 188. I believe that my colleague from Assembly District 20 laid out the fact that this already exists in law. You can already get approval within hours or days, and I am concerned at the trend across this country of undermining the FDA. As a history teacher, I know that the FDA was created for a reason. It is there to protect us and to protect our constituents. Their process is not onerous, and I am very concerned at Nevada joining the trends across this nation of undermining trust in the FDA and not protecting our consumers and our constituents. Thank you.
Are there any further remarks on Assembly Bill 188? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Sorry. Assemblywoman Kasama, did you want to make remarks? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to...
Assemblywoman, could you ask for Order of Business 15, please?
Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
I'm just concerned by some of my colleagues' statements. It's crucial to understand that the right to try legislation does not grant carte blanche access to any and all experimental treatments, including the use of stem cells. The law is subject to specific guidelines and limitations that protect both patients and the integrity of medical research. In regarding to the areas of stem cell, the research and treatment is highly controversial and heavily regulated area of medical research. In the United States, the use of stem cells or fetal tissue in research is governed by the National Institute of Health Revitalization Act of 1993. AB 188 is designed to give patients with life-threatening illnesses the opportunity to access individualized experimental treatments. The intent of this legislation is to offer hope and possible solutions for patients who have exhausted all other available treatment options. I thank my colleagues for their bipartisan support that gives hope to Nevadans. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further remarks? Assemblyman Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of AB 188, Order of Business 15.
Order of Business 15.
I don't have a prepared remark, but I would like to say this is going to provide a treatment and some hope for people that may be hopeless. They are at wit's end. The treatment is going to be supervised by a doctor. There will be protocols to oversee the administration of the medication or the treatment, and it should be their right to pursue that hope.
Are there any further remarks on Assembly Bill 188? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 33 ayes, 9 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 340, introduced by Assemblyman Summers Armstrong et al. An act relating to property, revising provisions relating to summary evictions, and providing other matters properly relating thereto. The people of the state of Nevada represented in Senate and Assembly do enact as follows. Section 1, end of Section 1. Section 22, end of Section 22, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Assembly Bill 340 repeals, reenacts, reorganizes, and revises a procedure for summary eviction of certain tenants who are guilty of unlawful detainer. The bill replaces repealed provisions with a new procedure for summary eviction which applies to tenants.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? The Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed in order to transmit it to the Senate.
Assembly Bill 456, introduced by the Committee on Growth and Infrastructure, an act relating to railroads, establishing requirements for the installation and operation of wayside detector systems, requiring a stop train or other equipment to be cut, separated, or moved to clear a railroad grade crossing upon the approach of an emergency vehicle, providing a civil penalty, prohibiting the operation in this state of certain trains that are more than 7,500 feet long on certain railroad tracks, and providing other matters properly named thereto. The people of the state of Nevada, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows. Section 1, end of Section 1. Section 9, end of Section 9, end of bill.
Are there any amendments to Section 1 or the bill as a whole?
There are none.
Remarks. Assemblyman Carter.
Thank you, most jocular Speaker. Assembly Bill 456 implements various safety measures on certain railroad tracks within our great state of Nevada.
Are there any further remarks? Seeing none, the Chief Clerk will open the roll. Would anyone like to change their vote? Chief Clerk will record the vote. There are 28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill having received a constitutional majority, declare it passed and ordered it on the fast track to the Senate. Assemblywoman Howdiggy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A 1-minute recess, please.
We'll be in a 1-minute recess. The Assembly will come back to order. We'll now go to Order of Business 15, remarks from the floor. Assemblyman DeLong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to put on the record my vote on AB 11 should have been a no. I mistakenly hit the green button and didn't get to the red one in time. Would those comments be please be placed in the Daily Journal?
It will be so ordered. Thank you, Assemblyman. Thank you. Any other Order of Business 15 this evening? Assemblywoman Howdiggy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some announcements for the floor. I do want to remind the members that tomorrow is Denim Day in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so we invite you to wear your most business professional denim attire. We also have Hospital Day at the Legislature, and the Tourism Caucus is meeting at 5 p.m. in room 3100. Seeing no other business before us, Mr. Speaker, I move that we stand adjourned until Wednesday, April 26th at the hour of 11:30 a.m.
Assemblywoman Howdiggy has moved that the Assembly stand adjourned until Wednesday, April 26, 2023 at the hour of 11:30 a.m. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. We are adjourned.